When I was 16, I went on a short study abroad trip to Germany. 3.5 weeks in the middle of summer. I stayed with a host family, went to a German school, and went on a few sightseeing trips, including a day trip to Prague, the last week of our stay. Now, I'd scrimped and saved and begged my way to get this trip. So when I became incredibly sick the day before Prague, which was an ordeal that included a fair amount of puking and homesick weeping, I pushed myself to go on the trip anyway, out of sheer stubbornness. My study abroad group was a hodgepodge collection of teenagers across Illinois. Most schools had 3 or 4 kids on the trip, but I was a loner and quickly made friends with the other solo student, Joanna. Joanna is, to this day, one of the sweetest people I've ever had the pleasure to meet. At 16, she was tall and lanky, her face covered in freckles. She wore those glasses that were so popular in the early 2000s with thick black rectangular frames, and she had an almost constant giggly grin. Her smile was brilliant and teeming with the type of confidence you only see in a teenager who's just gotten her braces off. Joanna was also incredibly creative. During this trip, she brought pliers and a roll of wire wherever we went and would make incredible things out of it. She actually made me a completely handmade charm bracelet, link by link, with dangling cat silhouettes and different poses as the charms. She was making jewelry constantly, or writing out words, all in wire. It was absolutely amazing. I, at 16, however, was a bit more cynical and about a dozen times more anxious. I was only about 2 years or so out of a goth phase, and although I was wearing a lot less black, I still carried around a largely unwarranted sense of world weariness. Joanna seemed to see the best in everyone and everything, while I usually managed to see the worst. But Joanna was surprisingly tolerant of all of my whining and sarcasm, most of which consisted of snarking on the other kids in our group. But my favorite subject of ridicule was our trip leader, who we just called Frau P, Ms. P in English. Frau P was, in my 16-year-old estimation, every awful American tourist stereotype rolled up into one person. She was bleach blonde. Every article of clothing she wore was bright pink. Her shoes, her shorts, her purse, everything. This was something that, with my goth background, I simply could not stand for. She was also very loud in a very distinctly American way. This was 2008. Bush was still in office, and I had considered sewing a Canadian flag onto my backpack to avoid the association. Now I was in a group with a leader that made it impossible to deny that I was American, which was, of course, enormously embarrassing. Frau P was a German teacher, but her German was not good. As the Germans would say, sehr schlecht. So bad that it was noticeable to me with only 2 years of the language under my belt. More than once, she struggled to communicate with many different types of authority figures. Once, we sat in the reserved area of a train car and had to be shooed away by an angry German conductor. Another time, she led us onto the wrong bus in the wrong direction and didn't notice for 20 minutes. She was also a bit scatterbrained and flighty. She tended to act a bit impulsively when she had an idea. More than once, Joanna and I would be at a tour site and turn around to realize she and the group had disappeared without us. Needless to say, for someone as nervous as I was, this made traveling very stressful. So that day in Prague, I was still feeling weak and occasionally nauseous, and we were led around by a woman who I had almost no confidence in a city where I did not speak the language. It was summertime, so the city was packed, tourists from all parts of the world. Every few feet, someone would approach us trying to sell knickknacks out of these large leather binders, or sometimes just out of their bags. Prague was also covered with graffiti, and to me, as a teenage white suburbanite, this was incredibly frightening. So that, combined with the dozens of street peddlers, made Prague the scariest city I had ever seen. And on top of that, I just felt awful. In addition to Frau P, we were led around the city by a solely German-speaking tour guide who had a thick Czech accent. Everyone in the group had at most 2 years of German under their belt. And combined with the heat and the noise of the crowds, I'm almost positive no one in the group learned anything from the tour, Frau P included. I can't even tell you what attractions we saw or anything about the city's culture. I spent the whole day in a fog, grumpy and complaining to sweet smiling Joanna. Our trip included lunch, and we were served a cold vegetable soup that the majority of the group had trouble eating. We were all very unclear on the ingredients. I tried to get through it, but my stomach was too weak. So during our short shopping break after lunch, Joanna and I split a giant sorbet cone to try and dull the heat. One of our last attractions was a tall tower. I didn't catch the name or anything about it. It was super old, so an elevator was not an option, and I had no confidence that I could make it up those stairs. I told Frau P that I didn't feel up to it and asked if I could please wait for the group on the steps. Joanna said she'd stay with me and finish the sorbet. Frau Pei turned to the group and told them to go on with the tour guide up the tower. She would stay with Joanna and I. The instant the group was out of sight, she turned to us and said, "Hey, where did you guys get that ice cream?" We pointed out the place a couple blocks away, and Frau Pei left us at the tower while she went to get some ice cream. I was shocked. She left us alone in this hot, graffitied city with all these weird peddlers and thousands of strangers. Us, two 16-year-olds. I immediately start ranting to Joanna. "This city is awful. Why even take us here? Why not take us someplace that isn't, like, totally shady? I had just been sick. Frau Pei knew that. What if I just fell over and died?" But mid-rant, I noticed a tall, bearded, bald man dressed all in black, wearing a large, heavy-looking backpack. Beyond terrifying to me already, and he had one of those big black binders open, trying to sell us knickknacks. As he got closer, he placed in front of our faces a collection of words written in cursive with wire. Things like Prague, Czech Republic, even the shape of the tower behind us. I immediately shook my head. My face went hot, my eyes were wide. I kept hoping the man would just go away without having to kidnap or murder us. But before I could say anything, Joanna said, "Oh, no thank you. I can do that by myself." And she pulled out her wire and her pliers and just started bending. The man kneeled down on the steps and watched her intently. She wrote out, "Hello," in cursive with an exclamation point and handed it to him with her signature grin. The man's face was expressionless for this entire encounter, just completely blank. He looked at the little "hello" for a moment, and then again at Joanna. He then pulled the bag off his back, dug around for a couple seconds before pulling out a giant spool of wire and handed it to Joanna, finally smiling himself. In slightly unconfident English, he told her, "You're very talented. You should have this." Joanna tried to politely refuse more than once, but he just shook his head, closed up his backpack and his binder, nodded a small farewell, and walked off. When he was gone, we looked at the spool. It was stamped sterling silver. So Joanna left Prague that day, $60 worth of wire richer, and suddenly, Prague wasn't so scary to me anymore. The end.